And just for those of you who think this story isn't real sexy, when I first met my wife, Kathleen, she was a seminary at the Claremont School of Theology, and she came over and was hanging out with me and some other friends one day and was telling me about her sermon, and I thought, oh, I always wanted to be a pastor's wife. So I'm just saying. There is a quote that says, all stories are true, and some of them actually happened. This is my disclaimer for the morning. As they say on the Moth podcast, the stories here are true to the best recollection of the narrator. I grew up in a sufficiently dysfunctional Christian home. My faith was always important to me, and it was very much fostered by my paternal grandmother. On my dad's side of the family, I was the only girl for 3 generations, and my grandmother showed me strong faith and unconditional love. But there was a lot of misogyny and abuse in our family, and it was confusing to me as the only girl to sort through a lot of that on my own. In high school, college, and shortly after, the majority of my high school friends came out as gay or lesbian. But all of them left their faith and religion to do that safely. So I was pretty sure that was the only path, and while I was sad they felt they had to do that, I wasn't gay, so it didn't matter. In my 20s and 30s, through PMC friends, lots of therapy, self-struggle that involved starting to realize I might be gay, I look back now and realize that that was the Valley of Dry Bones. You'd think dry bones would be easy to recognize, but that's assuming you start with live, thriving bones. If you are in a valley of dry bones, sometimes that just looks normal, and you don't have anything to compare it to. My faith was fine. I was loving PMC, becoming involved in justice issues and restorative justice. I had accidentally become a teacher, and that's a whole other story. Life had some struggles, but overall life was what it was, and I would say it was pretty good. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I was pretty sure that I'd have to not be a real Christian if I was gay. There had even been some subtle and even not so subtle statements by PMC or at PMC events that had continued to affirm that in my life. And I was sure that most people in my faith community would still love me, but I was also sure that there would be several who would be disappointed in me. I have a strong belief that anyone can change. Without this belief, I couldn't function in the world we're in. So I think I was waiting for everyone around me to change. That would be easiest for me. Society was changing. Why couldn't the church change? However, there were beginning to be some sinews and tendons forming on me during the events in the first decade of the 2000s. I sat in my living room one day by myself, and the news switched to the same-sex couples being married on the City Hall steps in San Francisco. And I found myself crying inexplicably, with emotions I had not recognized. My PMC small group, the Pink Piranhas, we chose a book every other month, and they kept choosing books on lesbians. They say it was a coincidence. Whatever. Okay. Also, I found myself angrier than I thought I would be when California voted for Proposition 8, which banned gay marriage. And then also in 2008, the seeds were being planted for the start of the Peace and Justice Academy, a slight exercise in cognitive dissonance for me, as I was planning on opening a religious Christian school that would be affirming and supportive of all students, and not the faith-based school I had grown up in, but something modeled on what I was seeing in the community of PMC. The body had been formed, and I was unknowingly waiting for the breath of God to fill me. There was a concrete, specific moment when the breath of God filled this human body that had been assembled. It felt both like a baptism and a rebirth. It was not something scheduled or planned. For me, it was over the course of a somewhat ill-fated trip in Guatemala with a group of PMCers. There are only 3 of us who are still here. That tells you how ill-fated it was. Again, much like the teacher story, that's a much longer story, but it is fascinating. So, after 2 days of hiking had pushed me to my physical limits, this is why I prefer paper. Here we go, sorry. 2 days of hiking had pushed me to my physical limits. I was exhausted. We had been told by our unreliable guide, it's kind of like an unreliable narrator, but this one you can actually die from. When we started, that it would be about an hour to our camp. We were starting mid-afternoon after a full day of other delays. And after 6 hours that it had taken me to get there, it had involved walking in the dark on a path on the edge of a cliff that ranged from 5 inches wide to maybe 18 inches wide. I was following one of our guides. Falling could have entailed bouncing through several trees and dropping 50 feet into a raging river. I tripped and slipped a few times. One of our group fell off the cliff and had to be hauled back up by others in the group. Everyone else from our group had gone ahead as I was finishing up this trek. And it was quiet, lonely, scary, and it was the type of experience where all you can do is continue to put one foot in front of the other and hope it lands on ground each time. I dragged myself into our camp with a mixture of relief and resignation. As I walked up to the camp and the group, I was at one of the most raw and vulnerable moments of my life. I was physically, mentally, and the most spiritually exhausted I had ever been. The group of women from PMC supported me, walked me over to a chair, sat me down, got me a towel, fed me food, washed the mud off my feet, legs, and arms. And that surrounding moment of care, love, and nurture broke through my spirit and soul in a way I did not fully understand at the moment, but I know was the moment of baptism that healed some deep wounds and allowed me to know who I was in myself. It was the breath of God flowing through my body and spirit, creating a fully alive person within God's community. As I integrated my newly animated body over the next few months and fully embraced my sexuality, I realized I had been protecting God from all of me. If I didn't admit my sexuality, then God didn't need to reject me like the church had rejected many of my friends. Once I knew who I fully was, I felt the love of God as I never have in my life. It allowed me to be fully me with a fully loving God who made me. I was me, I was gay, and God was totally cool with that. As I've reintegrated into PMC over the past year, I'm feeling that feeling of fully alive again. This is a different congregation than I left 10 or so years ago. I no longer feel tolerated or that I need to be ready for a fight. It feels like the fight over queer issues is done, and it's a place to be celebrated within our community and not just tolerated.
Sermon part 2. It's kind of embarrassing because I was going to do the same thing as Carol with the skeleton. Yeah, I had it all planned out, and now I had to adjust on the fly. Yeah. No, but so much of what has been said today, I think I see my role as tying it together for us, and maybe inviting you to think about your own story within this story that we've heard a couple times. And so the silence at the beginning of the story, I was thinking back to the silence maybe at retreat, or maybe a space where you've experienced silence, but before maybe the sun comes up, before There's like one bird out there, and that sort of stillness, that sort of calmness. I think that's the beginning of this story, the beginning of Ezekiel's vision is that kind of stillness. A valley. Did I do the wrong thing? Dan, I messed up. A place where you're waiting, where you're watching, where a new day is coming, but it's not quite there yet. And in that stillness, I think, is where God shows up and speaks to the prophet. And I don't know about you, but I relate to Ezekiel's story, standing in a valley. For me, what comes to mind is what I've chosen for work as a hospital chaplain, which has been a space for me to experience death, in many ways explore my own grief. For the past 2 years, I primarily worked as our pediatric chaplain at UCLA. And so my list is very long with questions for God. My anger with God can be very, very big. The world is not okay. And I carry this sort of wonder about that often. But in the middle of that, right alongside the grief, I also carry this profound gratitude for being able to be present with people on a journey that can sometimes end in their death. I'm very grateful for the ability to walk with people in these really profound moments, to bear witness, to show up, to love people, to be in rooms where the only sounds, that sort of silence, the only sound is like beeps and tears. I'm really just grateful for that often. To stand in a space where breath has left a body, where grief sort of rearranges everything. Now, I presume I'm not the only one who's ever been near to death, whether literal or symbolic. I don't have the corner market on that in this room. Many of you have buried loved ones, sat at bedsides, weathered losses that have totally reshaped your life. When you hear Ezekiel described as a valley of bones, maybe today you don't hear poetry. Maybe you remember a moment, a place, a scent, experience, a silence. And so God says to Ezekiel, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Our bones are dried up. Our hope is lost. We are completely cut off. Our bones are dried up. Our hope is lost. We are completely cut off. This is true grief. And the language isn't really ancient at all. It's ours as well. Death occurs. Homes burn down. Jobs are lost. Relationships end. People move away. Children get sick. Bombs are dropped. Communities are shattered. People are stolen from their families and put in prison. We have sat in this room countless times, over and over again. I think this past year, every week we've mourned something. Every week we've come to this space with tears in our eyes, with our feet not knowing how to stand up, with just grief feeling so strong. We've experienced and tasted death in more ways, maybe this year for some of us, for some of you, than any years before. And so we could rush to the end of the story, to what's next. And in some ways that is true to know that we have hope, but we also have to be slow enough to grasp the gravity of the death which has occurred around us. There are countless stories in the sacred texts about people just sitting in the grief, of sitting in an ash heap with their friends, of bringing flowers to a tomb to just weep and scream and wail, of people sitting in the rubble of their clothes, no hope to account for it. To grieve is to be affected. And I think that's what I love about this community is we're not unaffected with everything that's happened. Whatever experience is on the front of your mind right now over this past year in your life, like we all are affected and we're willing to be affected by one another's stories. I recently heard a phrase that stayed with me about grief, that grief is love with no place to go. Or grief is love with no home. I thought that really just kind of captures this sense of standing in the valley long enough to feel the truth that the death is there. Don't bypass it, but there's this great love and there's just nowhere to put it. There's no place for it to find rest. And Ezekiel in the story doesn't pretend the bones are anything but bones. Only then, at that sort of place, that heaviness, does God say, prophesy to these bones, hear the word of the Lord. Oh, come, and breath will enter you, and you shall live. And then, as the story goes, something does happen. A noise, a rattling, as we've heard many times today, these pieces come together, and they're incomplete at first, and then the breath comes, and the bones rise, and the sort of like resounding army of people is standing there. So resurrection begins to happen. I love that we read the John passage as well. There's this slow resurrection that comes about in stages, piece by piece. Bones and tendons, flesh, then breath, as we've explored. And I think that's often, and I would imagine you felt that way too, that's often how it happens, resurrection. It's not often very quick. We don't leap from despair to hope really, really quick overnight. Like, who has ever felt sad and someone's like, have you tried getting over it? Like, okay, right, my bad. Like, there's a time to it. Time to rebuild, to rediscover our bearings, to rediscover the breath that we need. And it may be in noticing small moments, small breaths of God all around us, and that may be in noticing parents loving their child all the way to the end. People visiting others so no one is alone. And friends showing up in meals and compassion and support. Maybe in noticing the small breaths of God in a community that holds each other through unthinkable pain. And small, stubborn acts of courage. And the quiet reassembling of a life that was shattered. The breath of a God arrives in whispers. It fills what was empty and it surprises us with life. And so God's final promise is not abstract. It's, I will open your graves. I will put my spirit in you and you shall live. And what God means, I think, might be is this, that death is real, loss is real, grief is real, but death is never the end of the story. Not for Ezekiel's community, not for us, not for the world. But as I think we've heard this story explored today, again, an exciting, odd Advent story, but that death is a doorway. Death is a doorway into life and hope and resurrection. It doesn't mean that loss disappears. It doesn't mean that grief stops hurting. It does mean that death in all its forms creates an opening. Something ends and something new begins. Something ends and something else finds us right at the beginning of a new doorway we step through. I've seen it, and I know you have as well, these moments. After death, the community gathers around tables, and those tables had once been empty, but now there's a connection after a loss. After losses, friendships often really deepen, and priorities are reassembled. After fires, black-burned hillsides, all of a sudden, many months later, are just full of wildflowers that were never once there, seemingly. After winter, spring always insists on returning. After heartbreak, compassion often can grow larger than it was before. I'm sure in your story of death, your story of loss, your story that's coming to mind, there's something that happened where something new came out of that. A new relationship, a new connection, a new beauty was found that wasn't found before. There's always something God is growing in the ground that we thought was barren. There's always a stirring, a rattling, a sign of life. Resurrection is not just a far off someday, but it's a pattern woven into the creation, woven into our bodies, into our community, into grief its very self. So the invitation I have for us today at the end of all these wonderful tellings of this story is not to deny death or grief, not to deny that the bones are dry, not to deny any of this, but that the invitation is to trust that life does come after. Not the same life, not a replacement life, not anything that feels hollow, but a resurrected life, a life that has passed through death and come out changed, deeper and true. We walk through the valley of dry bones, and somehow God meets us there. Somehow breath returns, somehow we rise, and somehow the world begins again. Death is a doorway into healing, into community, into new purpose, into beauty, into a resurrection we cannot yet imagine. So death is a necessary reality, a mystery we will continue to see and believe that death is not the end, but rather a beginning. Amen.